Shalom. Our Torah portion for this week is Vayechi, and with it we draw to an end of the book of Genesis, and incidentally we come to the conclusion of the story of Jacob's life. Jacob is now on his deathbed, and one of the first things that he does in this Torah portion is to ask Joseph, his son, who had become the vizier, the prime minister of Egypt, to bring his two sons, that is Jacob's grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to him so he can give them a special blessing. Now, later on in the Torah portion, Jacob will bless all of his sons, but it's interesting to note that he calls first his grandsons to his deathbed in order to give them a special blessing. And what does he do? He seems to be favoring the younger over the older one. According to biblical law, the older son was given certain privileges and a certain right to a leadership position, etc. And yet we've seen throughout the story of the patriarchs over and over again that the younger son, contrary to biblical law, is favored. We saw this in the case of Isaac and Ishmael. We saw it even during the lifetime of Jacob himself. He was favored over his older brother Esau. And Jacob does this with his own children. He shows favoritism to his youngest, at least at that time, his youngest son, Joseph, and we see all sorts of problems that flow from this favoritism. And Joseph seems to be trying to break that mold. And what he does, he brings his sons, Manasseh being the older one, and he places Manasseh in front of Jacob's right hand. And he brings his younger son, Ephraim, and places him in front of Jacob's left hand. The right hand carries with it a certain aura of being privileged. That happens in many cultures. The right hand is preferred over the left hand. But what does Jacob do? He crosses his arms like this, putting his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left hand on Manasseh's head. Again, reversing the order. Let's see what it says here in the Hebrew, and then we'll discuss it. Vayomer Yosef el Aviv, lo chen avi, ki zeh habachor, sim yamincha al rosho. Vaymaen Aviv, Vayomer, Yadati v'ni, Yadati, Gam hu yihye la'am, V'gam hu yigdol, Ve'ulam achiv, Hakaton yigdal mimenu, V'zaro yihye malo hagoyim. Vayvarchem b'yom hu lemor, B'cha yavarech Yisrael lemor. Yesimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim, ve'chimnaseh yasem et Ephraim lifnei Menashe. When Joseph saw that his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, it seemed wrong to him. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head onto the head of Manasseh. Joseph said to his father, "Not that way, father. This is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused, saying, "I know, my son, I know. he too shall become a people, and he too shall be great. Yet his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, By you shall the people of Israel give their blessing, saying, May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. So the question we're left with here is this simply another case of favoritism? Is that what this passage is all about? Rashi has something interesting to say about this particular passage. He says, yes, of course, it shows a certain favoritism to the younger son, but it is to teach us something else. And what is that? He says we have to look to the descendants of Manasseh and Ephraim for the answer. There were two illustrious heroes that emerged from these two grandsons of Jacob. From Manasseh, the older son, descended the hero, the judge by the name of Gideon. If we read in the book of Judges, we read this marvelous story about Gideon, who was a hero, who was incredibly inventive, who with merely 300 Israelite soldiers defeated an army of 10,000 Midianites. And we see emerging from Ephraim another leader of Israel, Joshua, after whom an entire book in the Bible is named. And Joshua was also a great military leader in Israel as well. What was the difference between Joshua and Gideon? They were both great heroes, great leaders of the Jewish people. In the case of Gideon, we see that he rises up in a moment of crisis for the Jewish people, and he does something spectacular. And then he recedes into Jewish history, taking a place in the book of Judges and a place in Jewish history. And he doesn't seem to have any other leadership role in the Jewish people going forward. Joshua, on the other hand, rose up when he needed to rise up as a heroic figure, but he had studied, we're told by Rashi, and actually the biblical record bears him out on this one. He stayed at the side of Moses. He learned the values of that are the foundation of Judaism and the Jewish people. He was also something of a Torah scholar, according to Rashi. And he also had learned how to be a great administrator. He learned not just to be a heroic figure, but he also learned the mundane, boring tasks of being a leader of the people. He was an administrator. He could be attentive to those details that sometimes heroic figures don't want to bother with. And so we see that we learn something about leadership qualities when we look at Manasseh and Ephraim as they pertain to their descendants. So we do need our heroes. We do need those people who rise up in a moment of crisis, but we also need leaders of the Jewish people who are responsible, who are constant in their dedication to our people, who attend to the daily needs and those boring administrative tasks that go with leadership. In the end, we learn something from both of them, but it is that constant, responsible application of Jewish values that really count when we look for leaders of our people. Well, I hope that you will read this week's Torah portion, and incidentally, we bless our sons with this particular blessing. It says here, may you be like Manasseh and Ephraim. That in traditional Jewish households, that is how we bless our sons on Friday night. So maybe you will bless your sons. There's a special blessing for daughters. I will teach that to you at a later date. So read this week's Torah portion. Come to your own conclusions. Shabbat Shalom.
أبا شمعون كن بعوني لا دعيتك عينني أبا شمعون كن بعوني لا دعيتك عينني لا دعيتك نصب الليل عينني بالباكري لا دعيتك نصب الليل عينني